Thousands of demonstrators marched through the streets of Nairobi, protesting the growing cost of living. Intense exchanges ensued as stone-throwing demonstrators engaged police. These officers here are anti-riot police. Their job today is to ensure that no protester goes beyond here to one of the city's major road that is just a few meters from where they are standing. Opposition leader RAILA ODINGA joined the demonstrations on the eastern edge of the capital city, where his convoy drew throngs of supporters. Odinga spoke to the crowd at numerous points, calling for reduced prices for food items.
The cost of living is too high for the people, and so we are calling for the lowering of prices of food and other commodities.
His speeches were halted as police hurled tear gas canisters in his direction. The government insists that the protests are illegal, with the country's deputy president ruling out talks. Odinga supporters have also been calling for electoral justice after the opposition leader failed in his fifth attempt to become president.
We are telling our friends that we cannot violate the constitution. Our constitution has no provision for RAILA ODINGA to come into government through the back door. And we are telling our friend, our elder RAILA ODINGA, the only way to get into government is through the ballot. There's no other way.
Nairobi's central business district, however, remained calm as police ensured protesters did not have access. Business went on undisturbed. Many Kenyans are asking the two sides to find an amicable solution.
Raila is a Kenyan too. Let them agree to talks. If they sit down and talk, they will find a way of resolving this.
The African Union Commission and foreign embassies in Nairobi have urged the president and the leader of opposition to embrace dialogue. Enoxikolia, CGTN, Nairobi.
Surrounded by his supporters, RAILA ODINGA slowly makes his way through a largely peaceful crowd. But as the convoy passes a police station, tempers begin to flare. A few protesters throw stones at security forces, who respond with warning shots and tear gas. Chaotic scenes symptomatic of a country on edge.
Kenyans are suffering. We are hungry. We are fighting for our rights. We want prices to go down. We just can't take it anymore.
It was the third day of nationwide demonstrations in Kenya, following Odinga's call for bi-weekly protests earlier this month. The opposition leader is accusing President William Ruto of stealing last year's election and holds him responsible for widespread inflation and unemployment. Sporadic clashes broke out across the capital on Thursday, despite the mass deployment of riot police to help contain the violence. Undeterred by the government's decision to outlaw the protests, many Kenyans appeared determined to keep the movement going.
Today, tomorrow, but we want to relent. We want to relent, but we want to relent. Even night, we are very ready, even night time. If you say 24 hours, we will be 24, we'll go in 24 hours.
Despite the clashes, Thursday's protests were less intense than the previous two, in which 2 people were killed and hundreds injured. Fearing a repeat of the 2007 post-electoral violence, the international community has called on authorities and protesters to work together in order to appease tensions.
An East African country with more than 47 million people, it has been rocked by protests. The agitation began against the rising cost of living. It soon devolved into an anti-government demonstration, and now there is violence on the streets. At least 2 people have been killed. Looters have ransacked homes and businesses. A mosque and a church have been vandalized. The country is tense. Today, it saw a third large-scale protest. Kenyan police forces have ramped up security in the capital. But why are these demonstrations taking place? You see, they've been organized by Kenya's opposition parties. They ask protesters to gather every Monday and Thursday. The man leading this campaign is Raila Odinga, the most prominent opposition leader of Kenya. He contested the presidential election last year. He lost to William Ruto. Ruto is now the president, and Odinga has made a record of sorts. He has run for the post of president 5 times and he has lost every time. But in this election, he was quite close. Reports say he secured about 49% of the vote. So he has popular support, if not the numbers. And he's weaponizing the support, taking the government to task. Like I said, the protest began with people complaining about the rising cost of living. Kenya, like most of the world, is dealing with the fallout of the war in Ukraine. There is rampant inflation. It has severely affected the cost of staples like food and fuel. And President William Ruto has made it worse. He has cut food and fuel subsidies. Electricity prices are set to rise next month. Ruto says he's doing this to try and curb Kenya's burgeoning public debt. His motives may sound logical, but they've bred resentment. And they've allowed the opposition to capitalize on public anger. Odinga is using this to challenge Ruto's rule. He wants the previous election overturned. He wants Ruto ousted. His supporters have rallied behind him to take on the government, and the government is fighting back. Police have used tear gas and water cannons on protesters. They blocked off Odinga's rally. The government tried to ban protests altogether by calling them illegal. But this goes against Kenya's constitution. The law protects the right to peaceful protest. But the government justifies the ban. It says the protests are not peaceful. Also, political violence in Kenya is not new. The worst was after the 2007 election. More than 1,000 people were killed then. It exacerbated ethnic fault lines in the country. Even today, all the factions are under attack. Government forces are being pelted with stones. Odinga's private businesses have been vandalized. Hundreds gathered and destroyed former President Uhuru Kenyatta's property. A mosque and a church were attacked. There is complete chaos. And at this time, President Ruto is in Germany on an official visit. But he vowed to protect public property and punish the perpetrators.
I want to tell you that we have no exceptions on respect for the rule of law. And we also don't have exceptions on protection of property or lives. Everybody must respect the rule of law, and everybody is entitled to the protection of their property and of their assets and of their lives by the government of Kenya. It is unthinkable for any government to participate in the destruction of property of citizens. I want to tell you, as I tell Kenyans and members of the global community, that the government of Kenya will make sure that the property and lives of all Kenyans, including our visitors, will be protected, and those involved in criminal activity, including the invasions, will be brought to book.
Meanwhile, Odinga has said it's actually Ruto who's behind the violence.
Ruto's hands are all over this violence. When Azimio La Umoja called for protests in line with Article 37 of our Constitution, we never envisaged that in desperation, the state will respond by hiring goons and mercenaries to rain terror on peaceful and innocent Kenyans.
It's a grand political mess. Everyone's pointing fingers at one another, and ordinary Kenyans are the ones caught in the crossfire.
To me, it's a big loss. I've lost over 500,000. This is a very big loss. I don't know how I'll recover it. I don't know where I'll start from. I totally don't know what I'll do.
Religious authorities in Kenya have asked people not to protest. International observers like the African Union are calling for dialogue. They say it's the only way forward because Kenya has seen enough violence. What it needs now is for cooler heads to prevail.
What's driving the recent unrest in Kenya? Opposition leaders say they're protesting against the high cost of living. They also accuse the president of stealing the last election. So can this be contained or will it escalate? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Cyril Vanier. Kenya has seen several days of protests and unrest, sparked by a rising cost of living and political divisions. Opposition leader Raila Odinga is leading the demonstrations while calling on his longtime rival, President William Ruto, to resign. Odinga lost last year's election by a small margin to Ruto. He says he was cheated out of victory. We'll join our guests after this report from Malcolm Webb in Nairobi.
People are demonstrating against the high cost of living. The prices of food and fuel have been rising, and the government of President William Ruto has removed subsidies. It's opposition leader Raila Odinga who's called people to the streets. He's also disputing the results of last year's election. He's ran for president 5 times before and he's never been declared the winner, but in some of the past polls there was substantial evidence that he'd been rigged out of victory. But last year the evidence his coalition presented to the Supreme Court was not found compelling by the judges, and they upheld the election result. Previous rounds of opposition protests in Kenya have led to Raila being offered deals or positions in government, but they've done little to alleviate poverty or to address the stark inequality or the grievances that underlie the reasons for people coming to the streets. This time around, there appear to have been attacks on people and property by groups aligned to both the government and the opposition sides. On Monday, businesses belonging to Raila Odinga and also to former President Uhuru Kenyatta, who backed Raila in the last election, were attacked. Also, in the Kibera informal settlement here in Nairobi, a church and a mosque were burned. There were also widespread reports of violence targeting journalists covering the protests by police, by protesters and by armed gangs. Religious leaders and rights groups are calling for calm. People are waiting to see if the tensions will escalate or if the politicians will come to the table and make more deals. Malcolm Webb for Inside Story.
Last year's election results were very close, and Raila Odinga has rejected the results. The longtime opposition leader has run for office 5 times and says he was cheated each time. In 2017, the Supreme Court agreed with him and annulled the results. It said it found irregularities and ordered a rerun, but Odinga withdrew from that rerun. And at least 1,000 people were killed in the violence that followed the 2007 disputed elections. Odinga had encouraged his supporters to protest at the time.